This episode is brought to you by Button Down, the easiest way to start, send, and grow your email newsletter.
Hi, welcome to another episode of Django Chat. I'm Will Vincent, joined by Carlton Gibson. Hello, Carlton.
Hello, Will.
And we're very pleased to welcome back Eric Matthes, author of Python Crash Course, creator of Django Simple Deploy, and some other things we'll talk about. Welcome back, Eric.
Thank you for having me.
So, I was thinking of you recently because I'm going to be going back to PyCon US for the first time in 6 years. And I remember back in 2019, the first time I met you in person was at a PyCon US. I think we'd communicated online. And I remember then, and I think it's still the case, being shocked that you were not the celebrity there because you then and now have the best-selling, by far, Python book. And yet all these other, mere mortals were getting all the attention. So I guess I'll tee that up as, do you still fly under the radar at these big conferences, even though I think a majority of people have learned from your book?
Yeah, that's the phrase I use. I do feel like I fly under the radar, but it feels like a nice balance. People do know who I am, and so if people have stories to tell, they do find me, and I get to hear those stories of what the book has done for people's lives, which is really nice.
Yeah, well, maybe let's start with that. So you're now in the third edition. I guess just a high level, how has it changed? Because when did you first publish it? It's been in print for a while now.
I started writing in 2013. The first edition came out in 2015. And the second edition came out in 2019, I believe. And there's I did a bunch of revisions for the second edition. So the second edition was very different than the first. Not in terms of overall structure, but cleaned up a lot of the issues that people had found. And so the third edition was really just mostly updating. Things were working. And so I kept most of it. Third edition, knock on wood, things have continued to work well. And yeah, it's fully up to date. So it's been nice.
Yeah. Well, you're one of the few people who can relate. I just did the update to my Django for APIs book. And, sometimes it's as much or more work to do the update as it is to do the first one, except it's somehow less satisfying, I think, because, but it's, but I guess you wouldn't do it unless people cared about it and wanted to see it, right? So it's it's a little bit like a band playing their greatest hits. It's maybe not what you and your soul need, but you're happy to do it.
Yeah, Python Crash Course has a big enough readership that it ends up being really satisfying to do the revision. It's a lot more work than people realize. It's 6 to 18 months of full-time to 60-hour weeks. Yeah, it's just a lot.
And yet you wrote the first edition. And yet you wrote the first edition in 2 years while working full-time as a teacher, probably primarily in the summer, right? Like I sometimes think the updates take longer than the initial thing did.
Yeah. I naively thought I could write it in the summer, draft it in the summer, and revise it during one school year. And it turned into 2.5 years of most of my summers and early mornings and late nights.
And just at the end of those 2.5 years, how are you feeling towards the project? Because it's those things that take a while to get out. They start to burn after a while, right?
Things got very quiet after it came out because all that work was done. And you had this printed book.
Right, so it's the space after it you remember rather than getting it over the finish line. Yeah, okay, nice.
Yeah.
Well, and maybe it's, hopefully it's, we've talked about this, but you are published through No Starch, so you have a team, helping with various things. I think for me, given I don't have a team, I often kind of want to just like burn my own books, and I question my life by the time I get to the end. And, as much as like when I started, I think I'm going to feel so great when I get the update out. By the time I do, I'm just like, I almost hope no one buys it so I don't have to do that again. So anyways, having a team maybe helps with that.
It definitely does. The book is so much better for that team.
Just before we move on, I do want to say I bought the book for my kids. I've got the third edition, sat there, and I've shown it to them, and I've been like that. This is what you need to pick up when you need. They were like, "Can you teach me that?" I'm like, "No, Eric can. Eric can teach you."
I had the same conversation with my son. Can you teach me how to do this? Yeah, I'll teach you, but here's what we're gonna do.
Yeah, right.
Wasn't that? I mean, right? As a book author, people want you to do it live, or they want a video, and it's like, no, I put all the this is the curated, distilled, perfect version of it. Like, just go there. Why do you need me to muddle through my own my own stuff? That's kind of how I feel about it. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah,
It's interesting. In this AI era, people are still going to it, and I wasn't sure that would happen. But people are still going to it because, as most of us who use AI tools know, they're only really useful if you know enough to make good use of them. And so people are reading the book to get that foundation that gives them the background in order to make good use of LLM assistance.
It's quite important to have something that you know is reliable, right? And
Right.
there are very few and increasingly less sources that you can say, I know this is reliable. So Will's book, your book, like these stand out as exemplars of, yeah, actually that's a trusted resource.
yeah. Well, I think you probably don't go right to paying. You think, oh, like I'll use the free ones, so I'll go to free resources online or free videos, and then I think with AI, it just sort of pushes out that it's not even like post-tutorial hell. It's just that like, oh my God, I'm hearing different things. I just want a trusted voice. And then, you reach for your wallet at some point, right? Whereas I think those of us, like to me, like someone I trust does something, I'm like, oh yeah, I'm saving money for sure,
Right.
right?
Right.
Just because, and even if you're a student or someone else, people, maybe it's a stage of life. Like, I don't think it's just people in different countries with different purchasing power. Like, you have to come to that realization that your time and your energy is worth something, and be sufficiently frustrated by what's out there before you say, okay, where am I going to go?
Yeah. Yes.
So I wanted to ask you about your Mostly Python newsletter on Substack, which you've been doing for quite a while now, because that seems to be an area you can, write new things rather than endlessly update your book. And in particular, I loved your Django series. I forget, was it 19, 20-part series?
Oh, gosh. Yes, 20 parts.
Yeah, okay, I had it right. Yeah.
It's at mostlypython.com. I started on Substack, but I left Substack because they're one of these free speech absolutists that isn't really free speech platforms. And so I'm working through Ghost now.
Well,
And
Carlton, shout out.
Are you self-hosting that? Or are you self-hosting
No.
that? Or are you using their hosted service?
I'm using the hosted service very happily.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. And you're not charging, are you? Or are you charging? You're not, I don't think.
There are paid subscriptions, and what I'm doing for free subscribers is that most of the posts are actually free when they go out. But then I do some series, and typically I've done this series where the series is available to paid subscribers for a period of 6 weeks, and then it gets released to everybody.
And how do you find that setup working?
I stalled. The growth of paid subscribers stalled when I did the switch to Ghost. I also stopped. I also made all the posts free for a while because I didn't want to lose people in that transition. But our lives, my family's life has been all over the place for the last year and a half. We moved from Alaska to North Carolina, and that was a much more drawn out move than anticipated. And life under a hurricane and all kinds of things. So I have focused on making sure the writing is consistent and high quality. And I'll come back to focus on whether people are paying or not.
Yeah, I mean, I think we featured. I would have featured like every single one of them in the Django News newsletter, because especially your Django series was just fantastic. I think we featured a bunch of them. I was like, I can't do it every week, but
Right.
But I definitely recommend people, starting from scratch. Like, if they put the time in to do that, they're going to be so far ahead of other resources out there.
Yeah, for people unfamiliar with it, I started the newsletter because I have this book, but the book is self-contained, and it's a thing I work on for 6 to 18 months, once every 3 to 4 years, and then what do I do? So I wanted to write more regularly, and I wanted to write about a wider variety of topics than just an introduction to Python. And so it was a weekly newsletter for the first couple of years, and I just moved it to bi-weekly because weekly just got unsustainable after 2 years. Bi-weekly feels very nice. I really enjoy the writing, and I can make a morning or a day every 2 weeks to focus on writing. The Django from First Principles series comes out of a long series going back to Carlton's talk about serving a Django project from one file. And you were building on prior work as well. But every time I've heard of these micro Django projects, I've thought like, ooh, this is a good foundation for teaching people Django. Because one of the things that people get confused about when they first learn Django is they run start project and suddenly they have 11, 13, 17 files and are trying to make sense of all that. And if you're teaching somebody Django, a lot of your work is telling them, go to this file, then go to that file. And so it's really nice to just start with a very simple file, single file, and then only expand out to other files as needed as the project grows. So that's why the series expanded out to 20 posts.
I think that's a lovely way of teaching the framework. Like the bottom line is we're turning web requests into web responses, and that gets hidden quite a lot.
Right.
You know, because or where do you begin? You begin by importing a list view and, just defining the model on it. And then suddenly there's a template and suddenly it all appears and it's like, hang on, an awful lot has happened there. Whereas if you go back to just, there's a view, it takes in a request, it returns a response. There's the handler that, is dispatching the request for you. There's no middleware, there's no anything. It's easy to see what's going on. Then you can bolt on middleware, bolt on, whatever you want. I think it helps you to grasp what's going on under the hood, so to speak.
Right. And then when you've reached the end, you're like, wow, okay, this is why all those files were created by Start Project. And you don't need to go through that process again. You just run Start Project and you know where all the pieces are and why they are organized that way. I may turn that into a mini ebook. I might take on Will's burden and
just make sure you update it every 8 months. And as soon as you update it, get an email from someone saying, oh, like, when's the next update coming? Or, PsychoPG changed or...
yes.
I definitely greatly envy the release cadence of your Python book, but that's the burden of frameworks.
There's a lot of work there that's invisible around selecting libraries and approaches that are likely to be stable for a period of 3 to 5 years.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things that I've changed with my books over the years is how I handle deployment. And that leads into probably the rest of our discussion.
Smooth, that's the smoothest change ever.
Oh, you like to talk about deployment?
I like to complain about deployment. So I was going to say that my first edition of the beginner's book, I was trying to mimic, there was some Rails book where they just like, boom, like first chapter, basically you deployed something. And so I really wanted to demystify, and of course it's a horribly insecure thing, and Django makes it harder than it needs to be, and Heroku was designed for Rails initially, not Django, but it's possible. But I have increasingly, so the most recent version of my beginner's book and the beginner's book, I've moved deployment completely to the end because I heard from enough people. I used to have progressively more complex projects. I think there's 5, and then I would have progressively more complex deployments. So the idea was like, just get something up and then, show how you can button it down and, lock up allowed hosts and all these other things. But I've had enough people and teachers who've used it in universities say that they just skip the deployment stuff because it overwhelmed the students, or now that there isn't a great free option, the students didn't have the money for it, though presumably they have the money for their degree and to buy the book. So all of which is a lead up to say deployment is a challenge and probably one of the 3 or 5 things that Django could get better. And I know you have a Django section in your Python Crash Course book and have dealt with this pain from readers a lot. So I'm done. That's a setup. We talked about before, but there's a lot of new stuff around Django Simple Deploy. So go.
Yeah, so I was looking forward to coming back and speaking with you both about this project, Django Simple Deploy. And the reason for coming back at this time is I just made the 1.0 stable release of Django Simple Deploy. And for people who can't see, Carlton is
I'll put a sound effect in there. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, it came out of teaching people Django deployment for a long time and doing my own deployments. And every time I've done a deployment, I have noticed how much time I spend reading platform documentation whether it's Heroku, Fly, Platform SH, DigitalOcean. We all spend, unless you work for a Django consultancy where you deploy different people's projects every week, I think most of us spend a fair bit of time poring over the documentation for these platforms, not to tune our deployments, but just to get that initial deployment working. And so the core idea that I've had for a long time was to ask that question: how can we automate this process from the Django side rather than from the platform side? Because any platform-specific solution is only going to be useful to the people who use that platform, and also only as long as that platform is mindful enough to maintain that tool. So Django Simple Deploy is, the tagline is deployment for Django Knots with deadlines.
Ooh,
Well, that's all of us, right?
nice.
Yeah. And I think that's rewriting the Django deployment story. Django deployment has been seen as difficult and fraught with cliffs that you can fall off of for a long time. And I think this project rewrites that story. So in short, when you install Django Simple Deploy, pip install Django Simple Deploy, or UV pip install Django Simple Deploy, it adds a management command, one command, deploy. And then if you want to deploy to fly.io, you install the fly.io plugin. So it's a plugin-based system. And then you add Django Simple Deploy to installed apps, run one command, manage.py, deploy -- automate all. And it creates a project on Fly for you and pushes your project and opens it in a new browser. And so you don't have to, you need the Fly CLI installed, and you need an active account on Fly, but you don't need to read their docs. You don't need to go create a project. Your project appears running in your browser on a remote server as it does locally on your system.
Yeah, it's amazing.
So can I just knock one up in the air for you myself, Eric? One of the reasons why so people often like the Django docs need a better deployment story because they've got some, very, very minimal deployment docs, but more or less they've remained agnostic about deployment options. And the reason has been is because there's just no way of maintaining that. There's too many options, too complex, too likely to change and go out of date, and it's just not something that we could maintain in the Django docs themselves. So, you mentioned a plugin system for Django Simple Deploy. That's the secret to being able to maintain multiple options, you'd say.
That's right, and that's why it took so long to reach 1.0. Because when I first built the project, like proof of concept, I think was 2019, 2020-ish, and it started just as a Heroku build pack. And so it only worked for Heroku and it ran on Heroku's end. And then I had the shower thought of, how could I do that work in the Django world instead of on Heroku servers? And a management command is the answer to that, because you can run a management command and now you're running on the user's local system. So you can inspect their system, you can inspect their project, you can see what platform CLIs they have installed and that kind of thing. And so I rewrote that Heroku deployment script as a management command. And then I said, okay, can I generalize this? And so I built in support for, I think, Fly.io next. And then I wanted to do one more, because if you can support 3 platforms, then you've probably solved the generalizability problem. And so the pre 1.0 version of Django Simple Deploy supported deployments to Heroku, Fly.io, and Platform.sh. But it was all one big project. And so, you could already see the maintenance problem, particularly if you're going to try to continue expanding support for different platforms. So the plugin system is the solution to that. So I implemented an internal plugin model where each of these platform-specific code bases were their own plugin. And then I extracted those plugins out into separate repositories. And so now it's a nice, I think of it as a, what would I call it? A thin tool, a thin library, and fat plugins.
And probably the fat plugins are better documentation for these platforms than the platforms have themselves in some cases.
Yeah, I want to be careful. When I say you don't need to go to the platform's documentation, you don't need to go. I keep using Fly. Fly is my go-to example when talking about this. So if you want to do your first deployment to Fly, you don't need to go pour over the Fly documentation to get your initial deployment working. If you're going to maintain a project on Fly, you need to read their documentation. You need to understand how their deployments work. But the point is, you can start that learning with a working project. So you don't have to go pour over their documentation, find the right parts, find the relevant Django parts, hope they're up to date, try to get everything right, get a working deployment, and then move on. You start all of that with a working deployment. Um, one of the really cool things about this is I mentioned that the manage.apply deploy dash automate all. That's the fully automated mode. A lot of people, so that creates a project on Fly for you, configures your project locally, commits your changes, pushes your changes to Fly server, and then opens your project in a new browser tab. There are people who love that. There are people who don't like the idea of a library making a commit on your behalf.
Well,
And so
those are dinosaurs. The agents are just all we're going to do is review PRs now.
So there's a configuration only mode where you create an empty project on Fly, you run manage.py deploy without the automate all flag. It configures your project for deployment to Fly, but it doesn't make a commit. And so after running manage.py deploy, you get to review the changes. When you're satisfied with how it has modified your project for deployment, then you make your commit, and then you run Fly deploy. So you run the platform's deploy command. And so it adds just a few more steps. But either of these processes is really nice because it, like Carlton, you just said, it's a nice documentation for the platform. All the platform specific configuration is contained in one Git commit.
Yeah, right.
So you can roll
it's
it
easy
back,
to review. Yeah.
or you can just run git diff and you see exactly what changes were needed to make a deployment to that platform.
Now, how have your readers responded to this, right? Because I know part of this came around the frustration we both had around changing and updating our books around deployment things. What feedback do you get from readers? Because I know you have a lot of readers. So
I do, but it's not in the third edition. And so the third
it's just
edition.
it's just on your website then.
Yeah. Third edition of Python Crash Course came out in 2021, and I was really just kind of getting this proof of concept done.
So fourth edition, you'll just slide a sentence in there and then it'll just skyrocket.
Yeah, and it's fantastic because it's a nice abstraction layer. Since 2015, I have watched the platform that I target, Heroku, for the first edition and second edition. Currently, the third edition walks readers through a deployment to platform.sh. And so I've just watched those platforms for 10 years with my fingers crossed that they don't change their process in a way that breaks deployment for the book. And so this project, Django Simple Deploy, also solves that problem for authors, content creators. If you walk your readers through deployment using Django Simple Deploy, as long as one person updates the plugin when the platform changes their process, all your tutorials still work.
Can I ask about the plugins, Eric? Because I think
Sure.
in Django, we've got third-party apps, right? Traditionally, you add something to installed apps, maybe add a middleware. And then DjangoCon US last year, Simon Willison gave a great talk about a new plugin system that,
Right.
I can't remember what he called it, but DJ plugins or something. I don't know. And
Yes.
but it's like you don't have to make a kind of, you don't have to make a change in code. It will look in your installed plugins at runtime when you fire it up and automatically load the ones that are there. How's the plugin system for Simple Deploy working?
There are some things about this project that make it easier to deal with plugins than some others. One thing is there's no real back and forth. So when you run manage.py deploy, there's code in the core library, Django Simple Deploy, that inspects your system. Are you on Windows, Linux, Mac OS? What requirement system are you using? It also inspects your project. Do you already have a platform-specific settings block? That kind of stuff. How are you structured? And And once it's done, it does some validation. If it finds any reason the deployment might not work, then it bails before making any platform-specific changes. But once it's done all that inspection, then it just hands off. All the rest of the work is done by the plugin. So there's no back and forth. We're not just calling
It's
some
not like
plugins
you're
and
calling
seeing if there's other.
hooks.
Right. It's done through a hook, but it really just the core Django Simple Deploy tool passes a config object to the plugin, and the plugin, when it first loads, sends a config object to core. And so the core knows what platform is being targeted, and the plugin knows anything it needs to about the system and the project.
Oh, okay.
And it works quite well. It's a pretty. it's kind of like an API boundary. You define that boundary between the core tool and the plugins, and then just define a clean interface.
So what you're really hoping for now is someone to contribute a kind of a plugin that you didn't write. That's the
Yes.
The mark. Simon Willison said this: the mark of success of a plugin system is when you get one that you didn't write.
Yeah. And so I've done sprints for this project at several Django cons and the last few PyCons, and I've consistently gotten 10 to 15 people at my table. People are really interested in the project. And some people have really helped move the project forward. I lose names when I'm in these conversations, but
okay.
someone
We can add them
else
to the show
wrote,
notes later.
yeah, someone else, I'll throw two names. I believe it was either Andrew Mshar or Josh Thomas. One of them, they've both contributed and helped me talk through some things. One of them made a fork and just did a super simple, here's how a plugin interface might look. And so I looked at that, and that's how I implemented the initial plugin model. So I'm going to PyCon in May, and I'll stay for a couple days of sprints. And so when I do sprints this year, the focus is going to be who wants to write a plugin.
This episode is brought to you by Buttondown. That's buttondown.com, email software for developers like you. There are hundreds of email marketing software services out there, and they all pretty much offer the same thing. Collect and clean addresses, send out broadcasts or drip campaigns, get analytics so you can see what's resonating and what's not. Buttondown is designed to hook into the tools that you already care about, everything from static site generators like Jekyll or Hugo to payment platforms like Stripe and Memberful. You can hook your site up to Buttondown with just a form element or a simple REST call. Write emails in Markdown and then get on with the actual work you're supposed to do. New customers can save 50% off their first year with Buttondown using the coupon code Django, and if you email support, they'll white glove migrate your existing subscribers and archives for free.
And we can say too, you're also going to do a book signing, at least one,
Yes.
at the PyCharm JetBrains booth, which I'll be there for. So people should come meet you there.
And I think I might do an open space about it as well, because the nice thing about the open space is it's during the conference and everybody's still there.
From a sort of Django perspective, I'm really excited. Django Simple Deploy is one of the most exciting projects for me, is because it's been one of the biggest pain points, and it's like clearly a solution that we can get behind as a community. And if people have got their own opinions, that's fine. Just fork the nearest plugin that looks like yours and adapt it to what you need. But it's something that we can have a consistent story to beginners to turn up. How do I deploy my Django project? Use Django Simple Deploy.
Right. And so it's one of these projects. I mean, I say this with humility. There are projects like PyTest that I really respect, because PyTest is clearly focused on professional projects, complex projects. But I've also found it's easier to teach beginners testing using PyTest than it is the standard library's unit test. PyTest is a library that is so well implemented, so well thought out, that is the best thing for beginners and is the best thing for many or most professionals. And so Simple Deploy starts out looking like a project that's just for people who don't already know deployment. But the more you poke at it, the more it becomes just a tool for, it's a more efficient workflow for people who already know deployment for a platform. And it's a tool for authors. It's a tool for content creators. It helps platform providers. And platform providers don't want their documentation to go stale. They want Django developers to be able to consistently push their projects to their platform. They're struggling with keeping their stuff up to date just like we do. So it's a tool with lots of use cases.
I imagine for a platform as well, it's much easier to allocate the engineering time to fix an issue on a plugin for one repo than it is to allocate the more nebulous time of update the docs to make sure, well, I don't know what I need. Whereas there's an issue that says the deployment for platform A is broken, fix it here. An engineer can fix that in the morning.
Right. Platform.sh does mention Django Simple Deploy on their deployment docs as one of the options for how to get a working Django project on their platform.
So world domination is only weeks away.
Maybe months, but yeah, shortly.
Okay.
Yeah. The plugin conversation is really interesting. And so I talk about Fly, Platform.sh, and Heroku initially because it's easier to start talking about platform as a service providers. But after the 1.0 release, one of the things I was most excited about was writing a plugin that targets a VPS, because I have deployed to past providers like Heroku, all of these, and I've also done deployments to DigitalOcean, and I like having the option to do that range of deployments. So, in the post 1.0 world, I really wanted to see, can I write a plugin that deploys to a VPS? And so I thought I'd have to build some abstraction, okay, I'll target DigitalOcean, I'll extract out all the generic VPS utility functions, and then somebody else can write a DSD Linode or Hetzner OVH. And I think it was Tim Schilling pointed out, I think one solution is going to work for all of these. Yeah. And it wasn't until I had it working, I was like, oh my gosh. The plugin was initially called DSD-DigitalOcean. And I realized it doesn't know anything about the fact that it's deploying to DigitalOcean. You install...
All you give it is the SSH, yeah? You just say, off you go.
You set 2 environment variables, IP address and your initial password for SSH. And then it does the same thing it does for other platforms. It inspects your system, inspects your project, and does everything through that SSH connection. The plugin does everything through the SSH connection. It's a lot harder to write that plugin than it is for the PaaS providers, because it's no longer just configure the project according to their docs and push it. It's, oh gosh, we have a bare, for people who aren't familiar, VPS is a virtual private server. And so if you go to any of these VPS providers, DigitalOcean, Linode, Hetzner, OVH, any number of them, what you get is a bare server. So I typically use Ubuntu instances because it's what I've used locally. You can choose Debian, any number of images. So you basically get a bare server and you have to do all the configuration. And so the plugin, I did rename it. It's called DSD-VPS. And it's in the Django Simple Deploy organization. When you install, so if you wanted to try this, you have your project that works locally. You don't even have to install Django Simple Deploy because Django Simple Deploy is a dependency of the plugins. So you have your project that works locally and you pip install DSD-VPS, and that installs Simple Deploy. You do add Django Simple Deploy to your installed apps because that's where your management command is coming from. And now you run, you have to create a VPS instance on your provider. And DigitalOcean, that's called a droplet. Doesn't matter which platform, you just create an instance and you set those 2 environment variables for your server's IP address and the password you chose for SSH connection. And then you run you run manage.apply deploy -- automate all, and it does the magic. It inspects your system, inspects your project, and now it calls out and it creates a new non-root user on the server. It upgrades the server, reboots as many times as needed, installs Python. This version installs it through UV, which is nice. And then one of the interesting parts is you don't have a deploy command from a PaaS provider. And so I ended up solving this by writing a serve project.sh script, which activates the virtual environment, system environment variables. It also does some configuration to set up. I'm using Gunicorn, if I'm saying that right, and Caddy. And so it sets up those two as services on the server. So that serve project.sh starts those two services. And again, in the end, you don't need to know all of that right away. It just pops up your project in a browser. It's reaching that project through an IP address over HTTP, not HTTPS. Because I think you need a domain name to use HTTPS.
Well, you'd have to sign the certificate and all sorts of complexities otherwise.
Yeah. So unless you're doing a domain-based deployment right away, you're going to get some kind of warning from your browser that this is a self-signed certificate or HTTP. But if you're deploying to a VPS, that's not an issue because that's part of your process. The bigger picture, it does. How many people have deployed to a VPS by following DigitalOcean's Django on Ubuntu? So instead of reading that whole tutorial, which sends you out to other tutorials, how to set up your server, how to set up a firewall, how to deploy Django, it does all that for you. I basically followed that guide and then updated it with UV and updated it with Caddy instead of Nginx. But I ended up with this plugin, DSD-VPS, and realized it now works. We can't just say Django Simple Deploy supports Fly, Platform.sh, and Heroku. It supports those three and every VPS host out there.
Yeah, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, Carlton, I don't know if this gives you PTSD, but you spent some time fiddling with VPS deployments.
Yeah, no, and this is exactly how I deploy still. I mean, I use Ansible instead of a shell script. I do, various bits and bobs. But absolutely, this is so, this is something I was looking at. I spoke to Eric about with my Button project, which is currently on pause. I was going to try and ship that when I stepped down as a fellow, but my son was ill, so I missed my window there. But I'll pick that up. But watching Eric, I've been cheering him along from the sidelines here going, yes, Eric, yes, because this is sort of like from the deployment side of it, this is the holy grail. It's like, yes, something which wraps it up, and you can take the plugin, you can fork it, you can customize it, you can make your tweaks that you need to make it yours. But that basic spin up your VPS, provision it, get your projects, your code in place on the project and get it running. That's what we need. Then that's to have that in place is so super. So as I've been watching Eric doing this, I've been like, but that means I can just focus on the monitoring side. So for my own tools, and that's much more exciting for me now, because I did get exactly this kind of stress about all the options and all the configuration channels you could go down and all that. It's massively complex. And so, hat tip to you, Eric, for getting it wrapped up.
Yeah. At the time of this recording, that DSD-VPS has not been released. It is on GitHub. I haven't pushed it to PyPI quite yet. It's only working on macOS at the moment. This morning, I was just cleaning up integration tests, and the next step is to write an end-to-end test. But that's fairly straightforward. With every one of these plugins, the difficult work has been getting the initial deployment to work. And once that works, the rest of the pieces fall into place.
The rest can be bootstrapped. Can I ask about
I was going to say, I'm not an expert on deploying to a VPS. I've done it. It's worked for my very small projects. They're long running. They're important, but they don't have high numbers of users. And so I just get something that works, and it works for me for a long time. One of the nice things about these plugins is they become a place to use our shared collective wisdom.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
So we have people like, Jeff, who works for RevSys, Peter Baumgartner works for Lincoln Loop, or founded Lincoln Loop. He released a project, I think 2 years ago, called Django Production. And the goal there was, I think it's a library you can use, and you run a command, and it modifies your settings to use like his best experience around settings that work in production. And so now we can go back and look at projects like that and blog posts and take all this like hard-earned experience and dump that into the plugin. And so from that point, if we do that from that point forward, everybody who uses Simple Deploy to run their initial deployment gains the benefit of that collective wisdom. And it really feels like, I've watched people who have really good experience, deep experience with deployment, and there's no real way for them to get that out to everybody in a way that it gets used consistently. And so this feels really good.
Yeah, no, and it's exactly exciting for those reasons. I wanted to ask you about the sort of the second deploy. So
Yes.
I Django deploy -- automate all, and my new server and my provisioning, and then I make some changes. I commit my new changes, and I want to deploy again. I just run Django deploy.
Oh, okay. Let me take a step back. So when people want to make their own plugin, there's a better story than fork the existing plugin and modify it. I made a plugin called DSD plugin template, or I shouldn't say a plugin. It's a project, and so it's just a repository. It's in the Django Simple Deploy organization, and so there's documentation for this in the Django Simple Deploy docs under the plugins section. If you want to make a new plugin, so Carlton, no, I'll say Will's the Docker guy, right?
Well, I've been moved away by Carlton, but yes, I still have a book on it, and I had my learndjango.com site. It was all Docker.
You've forgotten the golden rule. Don't do what Carlton does. Just because Carlton does it doesn't mean you should.
With a healthy dose of caution and anxiety, I have followed Carlton down this path. But I still am familiar with Docker a little bit.
All right, so Will takes Carlton's advice to not follow him too closely to heart and says, I'm going to back all in on Docker. And Will wants to write a plugin called DSD-VPS-Docker. So his best approach is probably not to just fork my plugin. His best approach is to download, not clone, download this DSD-VPS plugin template. Sorry, DSD plugin template. And it gives you, it'll ask you like 4 questions. What's your target platform? Are you supporting the fully automated approach? What informal name do you want for it? And then it gives you a plugin with the right names in the right places, and it gives you tests. And so you can run PyTest right off the bat, and you have a working set of tests for your plugin. So all the plumbing is there, and so you get to drop into just the part of the plugin that actually does the configuration and setup. And so where I'm writing this serve project.sh, Will would write a Docker file. And so it's nice. You get a clean plugin to start with, and so you're just focusing on like your expertise, which is really nice.
Right. But I'm going to come back to my question about the second deploy, because the first deploy, you have to provision the server. But the second deploy, you just kind of, the second time, when you update your running Django application, you have to refresh the code for the files somehow, either a pull or a push, or somehow you have to get your new code on the server. You have to update your virtual environment. You perhaps run your migrations, you perhaps create static files, and then you reload your service, which is running the application. I haven't looked into it, so I don't know. How do you handle the fact? How do you handle the state change there of, oh no, I actually need to do the whole provisioning thing, versus no, all of that's in place, and I can just whiz through with the much quicker step of redeploying.
Yeah. So a fun question for this project has been, what exactly does the word simple mean? What are the boundaries of the project?
Simple to who?
Yes. So simple for the end user. So good question. It should be simple for the end user to do their initial deployment. It should also, so take a step back. There's a section of the docs that talks about what it takes to write your own plugin and the things you need to think about and the questions you need to answer before writing any code. One of the questions is, can can deployment to the target platform be fully automated? One of the other questions is, what's the concluding message you're going to give to people when this deploy command finishes? And so what it looks like, there's a .py file called deploy messages.py, and there's a success message. And so you have to write your success message to people. So they run manage.py deploy, dash automate all, say, and their deployment pops up in the browser. And so that's their first deployment. And Carlton's question, okay, they make changes to their project locally. How do they push that next change? So in your success message, you need to be able to answer that question. So the PaaS providers, that's fairly straightforward. Somebody pushes to fly. The fly success message is pretty short. It says deployment should be successful. You should have seen your project pop up in a new browser. If you didn't, here's the URL you can go to. To make changes to your project, make your changes locally, make a commit, rerun fly deploy.
Yeah.
And that's about as simple as it is for most of the PaaS providers. For a VPS, we have to answer that question.
Right, good.
And so
Okay.
I haven't written that success message yet, but I think for my approach of Gunacorn Caddy as services, I did set up a Git push. So I think the second deployment is make your changes, commit them, run Git push, and then I'm not quite sure how to restart the services. And that's a question, I'm not sure how much responsibility I'm going to take in simple deploy for that second deployment. That's not the main goal. I need to know that people can do a second deployment. But when we're talking VPSs, it's kind of a bigger open question. The goal is, I have felt like I'm standing in the shoes of the people who started all these PaaS providers by writing this serve product at SH and writing a script for it. Like they must have gone through these same processes and answered the same questions. So I might just put a small script on their server that says run this SSH command to restart all the services. Or I might say, you know what, that's too varied to do. And the only promise for this project might end up being, we got you your initial deployment. Here's the kinds of things you're going to need to do to maintain it.
Yeah, and when you talk about gathering the collective wisdom of the Django community, well, people can input there as to options. People can blog about, this is what I do next, and opinions will form.
Yes.
Can I ask?
I asked.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. Well, Carlton saw this yesterday. I posted a question on Mastodon. So I said all the PaaS focused plugins have two modes. There's the automate all mode, where it does everything for you, including making your commits and pushing your project. And it has a configuration only mode, where it does a configuration, which is the hard part. You make the commit, which is easy, and you run the platform's deploy command, which is easy. Should be easy. With a VPS, I have really struggled to come up with a configuration only mode, because if you're starting with a bare server, there's a bunch you need to do to update the server, create a non-root user, reboot it as needed, install Python, certainly, maybe some other things. You need to start these services at some point. You need to configure like an SSH key pair for Git push, if that's how you're handling code. And so configuration only mode feels like, it's not just one step for configuration. It might be like, I don't know if I want to do like manage.py deploy -- configure remote, manage.py -- configure local, manage.py -- push. So, I'm open to, people writing their own plugins can make this as complicated as they want. Like you can recreate the entire CLI for Roku if you want. I don't want to do that. It doesn't need to stay super simple. It should just be clear and simple for the end user.
Yeah, and I think that's a nice way of thinking about it, is the scope. If you give an example, that's sufficient. I always felt with VPSs, there's sort of two steps. First of all, you need to provision your VPS with your provider. So, okay, that's step 0. But then step 1 is get the web server installed, get the, whatever other dependencies are installed. And then step 2 was deploy your application, which was code, virtual environment, migrations, static files, etc., right? And running it. If you just have one flag, well, do you just go to step 0 before step 1 or after step 1?
Right. And I haven't sorted out yet. With the past providers, it's very clear. Here's your local work. Here's your remote work.
Yeah.
With the VPS, I haven't quite sorted out if there's more back and forth that has to happen. The one other big thing that's different about supporting a VPS is you need to do some things outside of the local project. So for setting up a git push, I believe you need to configure those SSH keys outside of the local project. And so as soon as you're writing anything to a location outside of the user's local project, they can no longer undo that with Git.
Yeah.
And so, one of the original promises of the project is all changes made in a single commit, you can approve them or roll them back as needed. This is a little different. But again, to throw all that up in the air, somebody who's looking for a tool that automates deployment to a VPS and saves them all that work probably wants all that done. You probably want your project running in that VPS if you're starting from a bare VPS.
I'm just thinking one of the reasons why I started with Heroku and then I switched to Fly and then I've gone back to Heroku is because Heroku is one of the very few that still supports Git deployments as opposed to spinning up, a Docker container. And of course, it sort of does that behind the scenes. But one of the challenges I found with Fly is I basically had to give people kind of a Docker file or and I really disliked having to say, there's this thing called Docker and containerization, but don't worry about it. Just use this thing, trust me, and we're not going to get into it. But that seems, that is the new way that everyone's doing it behind the scenes. And so I guess I wonder for you, with the Heroku support, are you using the Git based or are you also using a Docker kind of file thing with Django
For
Simple?
Heroku?
Yeah, for Heroku.
The Heroku plugin is Git based.
Okay, but the other ones you are not, right? You need to generate. Well, I guess this has changed, to be fair. And I was working a little bit with Fly at the time. They were automating a little bit, but it's still ultimately I would have you need to, and maybe I'm dating myself, but you needed to the deployment was different. You could Git ignore some things and Heroku wouldn't have it, but Fly would still see it unless you added a Docker ignore file. And so, it would create a Docker file for you, but if you didn't know to ignore it, then anyways, I just found all of that frustrating.
You'd have things like your virtual environment pushed to Fly.
Yeah, right. And
yes.
That was relevant because at the time I was trying to step through progressively more complex deployments, and yet it just felt very hand wavy. I didn't really see a nice progression there other than being just do these things. Okay, yeah, we're going to do Docker. Don't worry about that. Oh, you need a Docker ignore file. Don't worry about that. And then again, at the time, Fly was undergoing a lot of changes to make it better, but it meant that the normal cycle of these deployment places, changing their docs was even more accelerated. And but yeah, hopefully it's more stable now. It probably is.
Yeah, I've had the same frustrations that Will has had. So in Python Crash Course, chapter 20, the last chapter of the book, the last section of that chapter is about deployment. And it's the one part of the book where I felt that I wasn't really teaching people things. I was telling them to write this file, do this, trust me.
The whole book, and then you're just do it this way.
Yeah, and so Django Simple Deploy, I've had one person criticize the project. And that was somebody who knows deployment way better than I do and probably better than most of us. And their only complaint was, oh, you can't automate it all. People won't learn how this all works. And I think I could have another dinner with that person.
How could you teach Python without first teaching C and assembly? And, how dare you?
We'll go to the beach and melt some sand. So Django Simple Deploy really changes the way you teach that, because if you
Yep.
wanted to use Simple Deploy to target Fly in your book, you could have people install Simple Deploy, the Fly plugin, run manage deploy, -- automate all if you want. You'd probably do the configuration only route so they make their commit and run the platform command. But then you're free to say, the tool made a Docker file for you. You don't have to show the Docker file. So if that changes, you're not worried about like, does the text of the Docker file in your book match the current one? And so you can talk about what a Docker file is and what it does and what parts people should look for, and not worry if there's a few more sections or some sections are left out.
It always felt to me like a complex deployment, any deployment's complex. They just are. This is one of the problems. But a deployment's kind of like a grandfather clock or something. And if it's not moving, it's really difficult to work out what any of the bits do, because it's massively complex and you can't really see. But if you get it moving and you can watch it ticking, and you can watch the cogs go round, and you can watch the hands move, and you can watch the little cuckoo come out if it's got one of those, you can learn. You can say, oh, that bit does this and that, I think that's really useful.
Yeah, so I'll use Will as the subject for this, but it goes for anybody writing Django tutorials. So one of the reasons that Will would probably choose a configuration-only approach for a book is you could tell your users, install Simple Deploy, install the Fly plugin, run manage deploy without the automate all, and you can tell your readers, now run git diff. Now look at the changes you were made. And you can point them to some broad changes to look for, but again, not getting lost in the weeds that tend to change. And it's a tool that simplifies things, but also, like, if you use it right, deepens people's understanding in a much better way. Because deepening people's understanding of something that works is way easier than trying to get people to understand something that they made one typo that makes everything fall apart.
There's a semicolon missing.
Yeah. I was going to say there's one other point to this, and I think you guys can see that, like, this project has all these subtleties to it. One pattern we see in platforms deployment docs is they give you a very simple Docker file. Or they give you a very simple proc file, or a very simple set of changes to make to your settings file. And what I see them all doing is giving the minimal set of changes, because every additional change you ask the user to make to their project, the more chances they have of a failed deployment. And no platform wants people to fail their initial deployments because you'll walk away. If those files and changes are being written for you and made for you, there's no need to simplify it. And so when we're talking about a Docker-based deployment, I had this interaction with Jeff Triplett where my Docker file for Fly was copied from Fly documentation, and Jeff looked at it and said, hey, here's a way to make it much lighter. And cool. Okay. And so you can also add sections. I go to Peter Baumgartner's Django production. There are settings changes that he's making in that project that would be beneficial to a good number of people. And we can just dump those into the file, because it doesn't matter if it's 30 lines of modified settings if you're not having to tell people to type it or copy it or.
Yeah. And just to make this even more insular, and to give Jeff a shout out, not that he needs it, but I mean, Jeff basically taught me Docker for the Django Professionals book. And then when I spent far too much time with Fly, but it ended up that I consulted with them and wrote the initial docs and helped update the Docker file and a whole bunch of things. And a lot of that was just sort of showing it to Jeff and being like, what do you think of this? And he always had improvements. So I would suspect that the Docker file that's in there might have been one that Jeff wrote, because the initial version they had was something that an engineer who knew what they were doing but didn't know Django Python clearly, just looking at it, it was completely unoptimized. And so,
right.
Jeff and I did some PRs on that, and it must be odd for Jeff to be in that situation, sort of like a grandfather, like, oh, look at, but like, how do people, unless you have this grandfather clock, and I love that analogy, Carlton, like, how do you know how to really tweak or fiddle these things and see the results? Like, that's absolutely right. I hadn't thought about it quite like that. Without it up and running, it's difficult to see how these changes matter and to even use them. And I guess many people, they're hesitant to deploy something and pay that cost, that learning cost, because you do need to spend a little bit to have it going. But nothing like learning on the job, right? And nothing like learning on your own project rather than taking down, your company's servers by accident.
Yeah, this project is an interesting boundary between the Django world and the non-Django world. And so we're speaking about people like Jeff and Peter from the Django world, giving input about what tends to work well for Django. I've had some interactions where people from specific platforms have popped in and said, hey, this is what does work better on our platform. So they'll know something about how their platforms read and ingest the Docker file. And they say, for our platform, you should include this piece or modify that. And so this project's sitting at the boundary layer, like that plugin is really that boundary layer between the Django world and the platform world. It gives a place for people with expertise on both sides of this world to share their learnings. Which is
that
really
just
nice.
sounds, that just sounds such a wonderful world to be in. Like, as it matures and, the plugins grow, there'll be a kind of canonical place you can go and look. Even if you don't use it, you can go and look and learn and see some things that you might not have known otherwise.
Yeah, it was really nice for me to see that with the VPS work that we don't need a separate plugin for each of the hosts. I was a little intimidated by thinking about how big the plugin ecosystem might grow, but it really shouldn't. Clearly one for each proprietary platform provider, and there's no limit. If somebody has this super customized workflow that they want to write a plugin for, there's nothing that stops them. But we should be able to basically formulate a good Gunicorn Caddy approach for VPS, a good Docker one, and that's separate from the Gunicorn Caddy. But the VPS that I'm using, I use SQLite on the server. I don't want an explosion of CLI args, but one arg I'm going to add is -sdb, and so you can choose SQLite or Postgres, because that's just a switch in the configuration. I don't want to put DSD-VPS and there's a flag for whether you want to use Docker or Gunicorn, or I shouldn't say that because you can use that within Docker. But
yeah, I see your point. Yeah. Carlton, you have a puzzled face. Does that mean a question's coming?
I was just thinking about you saying you add a CLI flag for specifying your DV rather than putting these kind of things in a config file. Where you might have, or a TUI that does a quiz and says and writes that. Because command line flags are a bit of a pain to type, right? I don't know. Anyway, this is just a thought. It was literally just I was dazing off into creative world.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think I lean towards CLI args because it's a constraint. I know I don't want too many. Right. Whereas starting to find a config file, the whole goal originally was you run a couple commands and your project is deployed. So
yeah. And I guess if people need something more complex, then that's when do your own plugin comes in, because you can imagine things like S3 or values and a secret store and a DB that you need to connect to and a Redis cluster that you want for caching, and simple deploy. The default plugins don't need to provide that. Right.
And so, one of the things I wanted to kind of close out with is where am I going from here? What's simple? And so if we're talking deployment of a simple project to Fly, Heroku, maybe your first VPS, it's fairly simple. When you talk about AWS and the services you're naming, clearly not so simple anymore. But I think the name still works, because the name is there's a simple story for deployment in the Django world. And so if somebody who knows AWS well writes that plugin, then there's a simple deployment story for deploying to AWS. Maintaining it might not be simple, but the initial deployment. Sure. And so again, it's a good story for that, because you think about all the work people go to like learn how to get something functioning off of AWS.
Yeah, no,
It'd be
it's
a lot easier
yeah.
to have something that works that you poke at.
Yes.
All right, we're at that point in the show. I need to ask you again. You have the wand; it can't be around deployment, but we're still doing Django. There must be something else that you'd like to wave away.
You know, I have a post every year, every January. I kind of go through that question of, do I still want to be using Python?
Yeah.
Am I using it for the right reasons, or am I using it because I already know it? And I stay with Python because it lets me solve the problems I care to efficiently and effectively. And so that's the same thing that keeps me in Django. My work going forward is going to be to continue to clean up this core plugin boundary for simple deploy, clean up the testing story. If it becomes an established project, we'll have a separate conversation in a year or two about the entire testing story, because it's pretty interesting. But I also want to go back to my own Django projects. I have a project focusing on math education, some projects about music and whatnot. So Django works for me. Like I don't run into any of the rough edges. And there's enough shared knowledge out there that when I run into something that doesn't work, I could figure it out. People answer my questions. I've occasionally run into some libraries. I think it was like there's a modified prepared traverse tree, something like that, Django MPTT. And I was using it for, so that math project, it tags math problems. So that the spirit of that problem is your kid hates math, your kid loves Legos, your kid is learning algebra. Can I find some math problems that are about Legos that use algebra? You click those tags and have a bunch of math problems that your kid would say like, oh, I didn't know math could be like this. So I used that library and it didn't do one thing quite right, but I was able to fork it and modify it and communicate that with the founder. So I think the things I'm most excited about in Django is probably Django Not Space. Because seeing this steady stream of newer perspectives who already have their hands in the Django code base feels really good.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's, it's a massive, it's a wonderful innovation, I think is the way I would phrase it.
All right. Well, we could keep talking for quite a while, but we will have show notes for all these things. Everyone check out Django Simple Deploy. Eric, thank you for taking the time, as always.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank
wonderful.
you for having me.
All right. We'll see everyone next time, djangochat.com, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
This episode was brought to you by Button Down, the easiest way to start, send, and grow your email newsletter.